Welcome to our official MintCast podcast. I'm your host, Mnar Adley. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to invite you to join our Say No to Censorship campaign to help us continue to break through war propaganda by becoming a member of our Patreon. After being banned from TikTok and PayPal, then having our funds seized and our fundraisers on Indiegogo then taken down and banned from there as well, we rely heavily on your financial support to sustain our journalism that names the names and exposes the war profiteers. Now, we will link to it in the comments and description. 2024 is yet another election year, and once again, the establishment has put up two pro-war, pro-corporate candidates representing the status quo. In fact, it will likely be a direct rerun of the 2020 election, Trump versus Joe Biden. And the media is already stirring up the fear-mongering. But in this beacon of democracy itself, how can these so-called leader of the free world only present two parties and two candidates to represent nearly 400 million people? Trying to shake up that duopoly, however, are a number of third parties. As an independent media outlet, we want to ensure our readers and viewers can hear from alternative candidates, voices that are censored from presidential debates and within corporate media. And so I'm happy to be joined by Dr. Jill Stein herself, who is currently vying to become the Green Party's presidential nomination for 2024. Welcome to the show, Dr. Jill Stein.
It's so great to be with you, Mnar. So appreciate your powerful voice with Mint Press. I can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. It's an honor to receive that from you. Dr. Jill, on your website, you are proposing to put a quote-unquote pro-worker, anti-war climate action agenda front and center in this election and on the ballot in November. What exactly does that mean in practice?
Well, as you know, there's such a heavy hand of censorship and political repression in this country. It is a struggle simply to participate in our democracy. Voters are clamoring for more voices and more choices. People revile the two zombie candidates that are being rammed down our throats and are very hungry for other options on the ballot. We know that some 63%, it's at a record high, of Americans are now saying that the two parties have done such a bad job. They want other choices, particularly in the public interest. So, we are fighting that battle. There are many obstructions to being covered, to getting the word out, and especially to getting on the ballot. So right now we're very focused on getting on the ballot. And that's going well. It's a big fight. It is an all-consuming fight. That's why we can't be more present on the street and in the media right now, because we're all hands on deck for fighting basically 50 battles in 50 different states with 50 different sets of rules in order to get on the ballot. But the good news is that we are currently about 75% of the way to being on the ballot across all states. If you add up the total number of signatures, and it's about 1 million that are required, we have 75% of that done, thanks to the work of the state Green parties. And we are just, going full bore. The other good news is that we are very close now to gaining the votes within the Green Party to be the presumptive candidate. So we have won every one of the contests that have taken place so far at the state level. And we expect to have a majority of the delegates needed for that nomination, hopefully within the next couple of weeks.
Now, one issue at the front and center of everyone's minds, like you said, is the issue of Gaza and the Israeli assault on Palestinians. Could I get you to comment on the matter and discuss what you think needs to be done?
Yeah, quite simply, Joe Biden needs to pick up the phone and tell Israel to cease and desist from this war being conducted on Gaza, totally. And, the blockade, the use of starvation as a weapon, the total violation of international law, and, the conduct of a genocide, which is what is going on. And, there's enormous agency that the United States has here. We are paying for this. We're supplying 80% of the weapons in the budget bill that was just passed 2 days ago. Congress, in all of its wisdom, has just appropriated another $3.8 billion for Israel to continue doing what it's doing. There's another $17 billion, which is pending from Congress for Israel to not only continue its genocide, but also to expand the war in the Middle East, which is in full force right now, with the U.S. bombing 4 countries as well as targets around Iran, and just creating an unbelievably dangerous and outrageous situation, which is dangerous for everyone, not just for the people in Gaza, but also the people of Israel, against whom all of its neighbors are really being mobilized right now. Israel and the U.S. are making themselves the pariah among the nations of the world. And this is dangerous for everybody. It's a pre-World War I type quagmire with nuclear weapons thrown into the mix, because Iran is now allied with Russia in a military alliance, and Russia obviously has nuclear weapons right now, as does Israel, as does the U.S. So this could fly off the handle in the blink of an eye. That's just what happens when you are in the fog of war and in this kind of a crazy situation. So, in terms of specifically what's going on in Gaza is a genocide. It is the torture and murder on a mass scale of children and civilians. Every international law in the books is being broken. This is not something that began on October 7th. This is the continuation of essentially ethnic cleansing and displacement that was begun in 1947, 1948, with the displacement of 750,000 people, and essentially war that has been conducted first on a small scale, but periodically on a mass scale, against Palestinians who've been there, for thousands of years. So this is it's a horrific situation in which the United States is not only providing weapons, financing, but also diplomatic cover. So this is a crisis of monumental proportions. 2 million people right now are at risk for dying from starvation. This is a created disaster. There's nothing inevitable about it. On a daily basis, this is being created. Israel simply needs to let the aid trucks through. They need to open up the borders. They need to cease and desist from occupying Gaza. Occupation, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide all go hand in hand, and a true solution requires fixing all of them.
And what have you made of President Biden's response to Israeli actions in Gaza?
It's pathetic. I mean, it's incredibly weak, and it's enabling. So his response is essentially a non-response. He'll give lip service to international law, or asking the Israelis to restrain themselves in their mass murder, basically. It's completely preposterous. And most recently, we had the U.S. finally abstain in the latest Security Council resolution for a ceasefire. That's great. But now, the State Department, the U.S. State Department, is saying that, Israel's not breaking any laws. They just said they're not. So, we can continue to fund them. And the U.S. is also contesting the UN interpretation that this ceasefire is mandatory. This is not optional. This is not something that the U.S. can ignore. So, it remains to be seen what will happen, but it's very much a tribute to the resistance movement, to the Palestinian human rights, to the anti-genocide movement, which is strong, which is amazing and extremely uplifting. As horrific as the situation is, it's really been quite uplifting to see people mobilize around the world, and including in the United States, where, according to a Reuters poll, even back in November, some 68% of Americans were demanding an immediate ceasefire and a negotiated solution. So, the bottom line here is, in my view, it's not, in other words, to quote an old adage, it's not don't get angry, get even, that we need to compel our criminal elected officials to comply not only with international law, with US law, and with democracy, which is demanding that they cease and desist.
Do you think that the Democrats' position on Israel is alienating their voter base and making many of them consider voting green? What has their feedback been towards your campaign?
Well, this is my third run, so there's a lot to compare it to as baseline. And the enthusiasm and the engagement for our campaign is absolutely unprecedented, especially this early. And the key issue really that's bringing people out is genocide. And we're seeing a lot of lifelong Democrats say that this is the red line for them. They cannot conscience this, and we're really seeing a lot of people move over, to look at, for example, where there are some numbers here, the Michigan primary a couple of weeks ago, where not only was there a 14% uncommitted, which is essentially an anti-Biden vote, but there was also 50%, stay home rate compared to the 2020 primary. That's huge. I mean, and that tells us that this election is really wide open. There are many, poll numbers. To look at the numbers of independents right now, the people who identify with independents are twice the number who identify as Democrats or Republicans. So, there is really widespread revolt, and we're seeing the Democratic Party panic. This is why they have announced that they have basically engaged an army of corporate lawyers to try to dirty trick us, to try to find little technicalities to throw us off the ballot. And that's what they always do. This is no surprise. What's surprising is that they're saying the quiet part out loud now, that they are so terrified that their stranglehold on power is losing its grip, that they're resorting. Not only are they resorting to these dirty tricks, but that they've announced this as their policy. Several announcements, in fact, that they are not only trying to, quote, complicate our ballot access campaigns, they are also going to engage in what they call highlighting and publicizing the more unsavory aspects of their competitors' character. In other words, they will be just conducting shameless smear campaigns. But this is what they always do. They have good reason. It's not only Gaza. I think Gaza really pushes the envelope. It's the whole concept of militarism and empire, which really undergirds U.S. foreign policy entirely. This is a very disastrous policy. Gaza and Israel are just the latest disaster. We could look back to Iraq, where 1 million people were killed in the course of that war on behalf of weapons of mass destruction that never existed, and just a whole series of disastrous wars that not only create failed states, mass refugee migrations, continuing so-called terrorist threats. But these wars are also impoverishing us here at home. It's how outrageous is it, that child poverty rates in this country have been allowed to double because of the child income tax deduction. That's been allowed to sunset after COVID, though it had cut poverty rates for children in half. And somehow they can mobilize 17 billion, 60 billion, whatever they want at the blink of an eye, in order to basically transfer money to their friends in the war profiteer industry. But they can't come up with, the dollars to keep children out of poverty in this country. It's absolute outrage. So there are many reasons, really, why people are hitting the wall with Democrats, including that, some 63% of working families now are living paycheck to paycheck. Half of all renters cannot afford to keep a roof over their head. They are, severely financially stressed. 100 million people really mired in medical debt, 44 million in student debt, you name it, across the board. Really, people's lives are in crisis. And finally, there is kind of critical mass for people to start breaking through. And it's anybody's guess what will happen in this election, because there will be 4 pro-war, pro-genocide candidates. That is Biden, Trump, no labels, though they don't have a candidate yet, but they are proceeding to get ballot status across the country. It's almost inconceivable that they're not going to use that. And then RFK. So you've got 4 major powered campaigns that will all be competing for the genocide vote. And then there will be one campaign, which is our campaign, that is on track now. There are several of us with a similar agenda, but there's only one campaign that's actually on track to be on the ballot, that has a track record of getting on the ballot for most voters across the country, enough to actually constitute a real and present danger to the empire. So we're very excited and really encourage people to reject out of hand the propaganda campaigns that tell you that we are powerless and that the situation is hopeless. Actually not true. In fact, we do have the power. And in the words of Alice Walker, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. To look at the numbers and the data and the moral authority at this juncture in history, we have enormous power here. And the big question is, can we mobilize in time against the power of censorship and political repression and all that? Can we get the word out in order to mobilize people? But our experience, and I just returned, from like a 3-week trip to some 21 cities, something like that. People are really hungry for a different kind of politics of integrity, and Gaza and genocide is front and center in this mobilization.
Like you mentioned, this is your 3rd run, and in 2016, despite being smeared and suppressed in the media, you received over 1.5 million votes for president. But the censorship campaign seems to be getting worse now for independent voices. What challenges have you faced getting on the ballots, getting into debates on TV and on social media?
Yeah, and let me say, one other issue in that mix there is being shadow banned, so that, people are forever being taken out of our, social media network and being removed, and then having to, connect again. And our tweets, our postings across the board, have a very hard time rising up in the numbers. And that's just, it's not just in our imaginations, put it this way. When Matt Taibbi did the Twitter files, he clarified that we're classified in the same category as WikiLeaks. I consider that a great honor, but it is it's a practical impediment that does restrict our reach, and it just makes it really important, in my view, that we have to fight, in every modality that we can, email and just networking and word of mouth, as well as social media and legacy media. The independent media is being terrific, and we're having a very good series of dialogues with independent journalists, which is really going great. But it is a struggle to get the word out. It's extremely expensive jumping through the hoops to get on the ballot. And it's more and more expensive now because there are a lot of candidates, independents, who are competing for limited numbers of ballot access support. Where we have organized Green parties in the states that have them, and there are a lot that do, we have volunteers on the ground who are carrying the petitions, but many states require some assistance from professional petitioners, and those rates have doubled and tripled even in many, in many locations. So it's extremely expensive. That said, because a lot of the work has already been done by the state parties, we're on now 21 ballot lines, and there are several more that we expect to come through as our signatures are turned in and counted. In the next couple of weeks, we expect to be up to 24, 25, and to continue from there. So the numbers are going well, but we have roughly, well, I should add that 75% of the total signature burden is already completed. So a lot of the work is done. But among the remaining states, there are some very big hurdles, like in New York State. The requirements were changed in order to suppress third parties. And this happened, this was basically a Trojan horse in a much larger budget bill that people weren't even aware of to fight. But they raised their signature requirement to 45,000 valid signatures, which means you have to collect about 80 or 90,000 signatures, and they crunched down the time frame for it. So all that has to be done in the course of 6 weeks now, which is just, staggering. So this is going to be extremely expensive and time and labor intensive. So it's those kind of hoops that we have to jump through. And the usual smear campaigns. However, I've been so smeared, I don't think there's anything new they can find here that they haven't already used and really drummed into the ground. The biggest of them being, the Russian asset smear. And for that, I was investigated for 3 years for the Senate Intelligence Committee that finally gave me basically, a complete bill of good health. And, that there was nothing untoward in my record. There was nothing to see there. That turned up like in the, I don't know, maybe page 700 of their 5th report. So it was completely unseen, whereas that photograph continued to circulate with a whole smear campaign along with it. So it's not like that's gone away, but sort of people have, if you haven't been convicted of something, and there's been no finding over a period of now like 6 years, 6 or 7 years, it just starts to really wear thin. So I'm not too worried about the continuing smear campaigns, especially at a time when most Americans reject mainstream media and presume that mainstream media is lying to you and purposefully misleading you. So it's like their weapons have really kind of grown very, very stale. Not too worried about that. The main thing is getting on the ballot. And I would just put out there for anyone who wants to see a pro-worker, anti-war, anti-genocide, climate emergency campaign on the ballot across the country, we can definitely use your help. If you're not in a state where we're struggling, you can help with phone banking and all that. So go to jillstein2024.com and join the team.
Well, I think most Americans are aware that environmental issues are a key factor driving the Green Party and its base, but many people don't understand how environmentalism and militarism intersect. You have made U.S. empire front and center of your campaign, with the military contributing to climate change and environmental breakdown. Could you discuss that for us, please?
Oh, sure. I mean, because war is by definition, it's a war on air and water and food systems. I mean, war is incredibly destructive and the environment is everywhere being destroyed in the course of war. Witness how in Gaza, this threat of flooding the tunnels in order to go after Hamas, would essentially destroy the aquifers permanently, the water source for Gaza. It's just insane that that kind of thing is even contemplated. But, this is one of the leading impacts of war is that it destroys our food and our water and, air quality, biodiversity, you name it, even just preparations for war and developing weapons, like the use of sonar and underwater weapons is extremely destructive. And our oceans are really teetering at the brink right now and are very close to environmental collapse for many reasons, and war and weapons and explosions and ammunition, have absolutely everything to do with that. Let me mention also the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, which was really part of the Cold War with Russia and the economics underlying Cold War. Why did we either blow it up or give the thumbs up to that worst environmental sabotage ever? The worst release of methane gas ever in history. Why did we do that? Because the U.S. wanted the markets, and that's why there were congratulations and high fives all around from from State Department and US officials and their allies, celebration that, oh, great, now we have a wonderful new market to expand into. And in fact, Joe Biden seized the moment in order to authorize the building then of 20 new liquid natural gas export facilities on coastal US, which are extremely destructive and both to the coast and to the communities largely of color that have to deal with these pipelines and their harm and their leaks and so on. But that body of 22 new liquid natural gas plants knocks us back. It knocks all the progress on emissions reduction back to 2005 levels. So, I try to remind people who are worried about Donald Trump that actually Biden's environmental policies make Donald Trump look like a climate activist, because there's no development across the board that is as destructive as these new LNG plants. Now, I know that's kind of a circuitous tie to war, but the other connection here is that war requires energy, a huge amount of energy. And in fact, the Pentagon, if it were a nation, it would be ranking somewhere around 41st, in the list of, 190 nations or so. So it is a huge cause of fossil fuel emissions. And of course, these are not cataloged. They are not tracked, so in every way imaginable, war is the opposite. And in fact, as a solution, we need to move our war dollars, which are only destroying global security as well as the environment. We need to move war dollars into Green New Deal dollars, global Green New Deal, addressing, both the crisis of our economy as well as the crisis of our climate. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be done here, and it's a state of emergency all around.
I'm glad you mentioned the Green New Deal, because if I remember correctly, the Democratic Party stole that name that you came up with and placed it on their watered down version of a climate plan action. Tell us more about that.
Nature doesn't care about renewable energy. People do, but it doesn't help the climate one bit. What helps the climate is eliminating fossil fuels. That's what our Green New Deal is about. Our Green New Deal is an emergency economic and ecological program that creates millions of jobs, puts people to work, reestablishes a productive economy as opposed to the financialized rip-off economy that we currently have. It creates productive economy, which includes producing the actual concrete things we need in order to eliminate fossil fuels and phase them out. And we call for a 10-year emergency program. One of the things that our administration would do on day one is declare a climate emergency, which would then unleash hundreds of billions of dollars in funding so that we can actually begin doing this even before we have moved a budget through Congress, which will be work. It will be work, but it will be work to get elected. And we won't get elected without creating a strong grassroots movement that will then have to go to work starting on day one to move an agenda forward that, that moves those dollars from war to actually urgent and emergency needs here at home, including the climate. Oh, and I should add also, it's not just our Green New Deal that Democrats tried to appropriate, and they just give it lip service. It's also, who launched the Medicare for All, single payer? That was Ralph Nader in his green run for president in 2000. Look at the way they hijacked the proposal that I had put on the table in 2012 to make public higher education free and to make student debt, to basically abolish it. If we bailed out the crooks on Wall Street who crashed the economy, we can bail out the victims of that economic crash and just do away with student debt. It can be done, and there are many ways to do it. That was ridiculed when I first put that out in 2012. And even the guy leading the ridicule, John Oliver, recently put out a statement, or did a segment extolling the abolition of student debt. And I don't think he talked about, exactly how it can be done any more than they talk about how we can come up with $17 billion, in the blink of an eye to expand genocide. So, yeah, I mean, we've put a lot on the table. Reparations, that too was launched as a national issue, reparations for African Americans and for Indigenous Americans as well. Most of what's good now in the Democrats' agenda is actually hijacked from what the Greens, put on the table. We've been ahead of the curve because we are not a creature of corporate campaign contributions. We don't accept corporate PAC money. We do not sanction super PACs or dark money, and all the things that basically buy influence within the Democratic and Republican parties. We disavow that, and we don't just say, look at what we say, not at what we do. We walk the walk as well as talking the talk, which is absolutely critical if we're going to turn this around and create the real sort of system change that we need. We're not going to do this just with window dressing on the margins.
I wanted to give you the opportunity to discuss your advanced platform on other issues as well. What, for instance, are the priorities of your campaign right now?
So, of course, Medicare for all, healthcare is a human right. This not only makes us healthier, 1 out of every 3 COVID deaths, for example, was linked to a lack of health insurance and healthcare on that account. There are some 70,000 deaths per year that results strictly from the lack of health insurance. Some 87 million Americans who either are uninsured or underinsured, millions of people who do not have access to their medication because the prices are absolutely unaffordable, simply because of price gouging by the pharmaceutical companies. There's so much that can be done here simply by eliminating the bureaucracy, the red tape, and the waste that are built into healthcare. 1 out of every 3 healthcare dollars right now is basically spent on paper pushing. So consolidating that system into a single payer Medicare for all, improved Medicare for all type system would enable everyone to be covered from head to toe, including chronic care as well as acute care, mental health care, eyeglasses, dental care, things that are not covered at all right now that really leave people in bankruptcy, even people with health insurance. That is the largest source of bankruptcy. So this is like a no-brainer. And it saves us, by the way, $500 billion a year. Why don't we have this? This is just like mind-boggling. So this would be one of the very first things that we do. And it may be possible, in fact, to declare a healthcare emergency and for the president to basically initiate this transition on day one. We're sort of exploring the legalities around that now, but one way or another, there's so much public support for this across the political spectrum that, this will be a major and early focus. The drug wars are just to look at like immigration policy right now, which is such a source of misinformation and xenophobia and demagoguery on the part of both parties' leadership, that you see Biden essentially adopting Trump's policies. And, this is, it's outrageous, it's wrongheaded, and it's extremely unjust because the people who are coming here for refuge, for asylum, are largely fleeing crises that we as the United States have caused, whether it's war or climate change or economic destabilization. So many countries that we have overthrown. There's a list of some 70 countries that where we have exercised regime change since the Second World War. And this initiates lasting chaos. To look at, say, Guatemala or Honduras or, Iran, even, the chaos and the crises in those states, in those nations, really began with the U.S. overthrow of democratically elected governments who were doing something for their people, who were, like in the case of Guatemala, was redistributing land on behalf of the peasants so that peasants could have some financial security and self-sufficiency. And at the behest of United Fruit, the U.S. went in and overthrew their government. Or to look at Haiti, which has been in chaos for centuries, but most recently the U.S. overthrew Aristide, their democratically elected government, twice. And after he was overthrown for the second time, Hillary Clinton went to Haiti to overturn their minimum wage law, which had been passed by referendum, raising their minimum wage from 30 cents an hour to 60 cents an hour. And Hillary Clinton had that overturned and rolled back. So this is the kind of influence that the US exerts and why we overthrow democracies so that we can continue to pillage and extract resources and wealth from countries all around the world. So this is why we have a flood of migrants. And if we want to stop the surge of migrants to our countries, let's stop making their home countries unlivable, including with the drug wars. And by the way, that's a problem that could be fixed on day one as well, when, as president, I would reclassify, for starters, certainly marijuana and possibly some other drugs as well. But marijuana is kind of the workhorse of the cartels and the drug industry, and that just creates all the violence and the chaos and the misery, which in turn is a major driver of the migration as well. So that's number one about immigrants. Stop forcing them to flee their homes. And then number two is let's process them properly and respectfully and provide the staff at the border and the lawyers and the legal assistants and so on to ensure that people can get their papers, to ensure that people aren't coming in with criminal records or fleeing crime and violence that they have perpetrated. We need to run those checks and get people papered right away so that they can go to work. And then we need to provide transitional support for them to get plugged in, because we know that migrants are a huge source of support and are a terrific economic benefit and resource for local communities at the state level and at the national level. So it's outrageous that this sense of burden and emergency has been created when it's anything but. And, I could say a word about the prison industrial complex as well. This has largely resulted from the war on drugs, and people of color are being incarcerated in vastly disproportionate numbers. We need to end the use of the private prison industry and basically exonerate people who've been convicted of nonviolent drug possession and other drug-related crimes. We can empty out our prisons and stop refilling them. And in addition, related to that, we want to use all the resources for community safety and security. Right now, in the same way that military is consuming half of our congressional budget, you also have police that are consuming commonly half of their municipal budgets, and more. And our communities are not getting safer on that account, and police violence is only increasing with greater funding of police. We see things like Cop City, in Atlanta, and there are actually scores of such cop cities all around the country where militarization of police is having a horrific effect and is also consuming like open space and environmental resources, and where people are protesting because we don't want this. It doesn't do us any good to have these sprawling militarized police training facilities, which go hand in hand with the recycling of military equipment into local police forces. This is a disaster, and people are widely protesting it. People are being criminalized for protesting it. And in the effort to put it on the ballot, this is being suppressed. It's just an outrage. And these are largely Democratic governments, as in Atlanta, that are perpetrating this local violence and political repression, and assault on our civil liberties. So these are things that we would change across the board so that we're using our budget for true security needs, not to mention that so much crime, is a response to hopelessness and the failure of economies to meet local needs. So we would be putting those dollars instead of into expanding police forces endlessly. We would be creating not only alternative emergency responses, which cities are starting to do now around the country very successfully. So they're diverting mental health cases or homelessness. They're not arresting people on the street for sleeping outdoors. Instead, they are actually treating these problems and plugging in social workers and other kinds of social support. This should not be going into our jails. Mental health problems should not be filling our jails. Homelessness should not be filling our jails. There are better ways that we can use our resources to actually preempt these problems at the outset. And by having a government which is of, by, and for the people instead of, by, and for the corporations, we know this is fixable, and the American people know this is fixable as well.
Everything you just mentioned reaffirms that we do live in a militarized society and a corporatocracy whose tentacles have spread far and wide into every aspect of our society. Another issue you've discussed as imperative for improving democracy is bringing in ranked choice voting. What is that? How does it work? And how will it improve things in terms of the fear-based campaigns that we have now?
So this is a critical democracy reform, and we have a whole agenda of things that will re-engage and really reclaim the promise of democracy. Democracy has always been a very flawed animal, but in this country, but it has been, really thrown under the bus in so many ways. And a big part of that is this politics of fear and this climate of fear. So you have people being extorted by fear into voting against the candidate that they most dislike instead of voting for what it is that we want. How do we ever move forward an agenda for people, planet, and peace if we don't say that agenda? If we don't name what it is and then work towards it and hold people accountable for it? You can't get there simply by saying what you don't want or who you think the most dangerous candidate is. And it's outrageous that people feel like they have to choose between two dangerous candidates, two deadly candidates. When people try to apply the lesser evil rule, it can be very hard to figure that out, especially now that you have Joe Biden and the Democrats, who were once considered the lesser evil. They are now the major proponents and the major driving force behind the genocidal war in Gaza. Not that the Republicans are taking an exemplary stand here, but they at least had some dissident votes, whereas the Democrats were largely all in lockstep voting for this most recent child starvation bill, which is just, shocking and incredible. So ranked choice voting, basically, it takes the fear out of your vote, and it allows you to do exactly what it says. Instead of just casting a vote for one person, you rank your choices, and it gives you the assurance that if your first choice is an underdog who's going to lose or you think might lose, but you'd like to express your support for their agenda, you can do that knowing that your vote, if that person loses in the runoffs that are built into the counting of the vote, if your first choice loses in the first round, your vote is automatically reassigned to your second choice. And same thing going through if you have three choices or whatever, until someone wins by a majority. If someone is winning with a majority, then there has been no splitting of the vote. That just hasn't been a factor in the election. So it's a way to assure people that we can stand up and vote our values instead of our fears, because the politics of fear has basically delivered everything that we were afraid of, endless wars, nuclear proliferation, the climate disaster. By voting our fears, we have essentially enabled both parties to now take those positions. You have to stand up and fight a corrupt system. In the words of Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. We have to be that demand. corporate candidates are not going to do it for us. By we, I mean we, the people. We have to be able to stand up and say what it is that we want. Ranked choice voting allows us to do that and to actually contest for power. There are several other, really critical reforms, like breaking the stranglehold of big corporate money in our elections. And that stranglehold only gets tighter and tighter by the election. In 2016, there was something like $7 billion pouring into the 2016 elections. In 2020, that number had doubled. It was up to like 14 billion. And the money is coming in larger and larger increments through super PACs and through dark money. You can have millionaires and billionaires who are basically, buying the election through a variety of mechanisms. And this is a disaster for us all. It guarantees that we will have exactly the government that we have, which is in service of weapons profiteers, in service of APAC, in service of health insurers, in service of big pharma, the fossil fuel companies. That's who's making out like bandits here. Things are not getting better incrementally. They are getting worse in a rather, alarming way. So we're really trying to drive the message home that we have nothing to lose and everything to gain by standing up and demanding an America and a world that works for all of us in this election and beyond. And however far we get is the jumping off point for a continuing struggle. We may or may not. And by the way, when you have 5 candidates running, the 4 genocide candidates and our campaign that are on the ballot contesting for power, when you have 5 competitive races, it's possible to win that race with 21% of the vote. That's just how the numbers divide up. That's not to say necessarily how it's going to be, but that is mathematically possible. So it's not like we have to capture all the vote. We're in an environment right now. It's kind of the perfect storm in so many ways, including how the vote potentially could fall out in such a way that could empower us to turn the White House into a greenhouse, and the world would be the better for it. That could happen. But even if it doesn't happen, if we simply get to 5% of the vote, then it provides a whole lot more money for the next presidential election for the Green Party. So whether we get there in small steps or in one fell swoop, and the odds have never been better for transformative change in a single election than they are right now. However that happens, it's a win. It's either a win because we win the office or we win the day. And we have to own this. It's like not only an opportunity, it's kind of our responsibility if we want a world that we are going to survive in. No pressure, but this is a moment that we have to seize, and our lives and futures really depend on that.
I mean, how does the media perpetuate this problem of the two-party system? Let's talk about the press and what their agenda is and how they push this fear-based voting system.
It's huge. I mean, this is all about the First Amendment. This is why the First Amendment is first, because we need freedom of the press. We need a press that acts as a watchdog on power, not a lapdog to power. And with corporate consolidation of the media, which has been enormous, it went from however many, I don't know, 90, 50, whatever. But there were multiple corporations involved. Now they've all been consolidated into 5 or 6. And that was as recently as like 10 years ago. I don't even know what it is now. It might be even worse. But, there's enormous discipline that's enforced through this corporate consolidated media. And there's a whole new ethic, a kind of neoliberal ethic of the press now, where it's all about careerism and advancing your career and kissing up to power so that you can get the good interviews. And so power is not held accountable. This is why the press has been absolutely AWOL on Julian Assange, very reluctant to, stand up and recognize that as he goes, they go too, because Assange was and is a true watchdog, not a lapdog. And he exposed criminality and, violations of international law and corruption on the part of governments. and big people in government, and that's what the press is supposed to do. And shame on the press for not, that is, present company accepted, of course, but mainstream media for not standing up for Julian Assange and themselves and the First Amendment. This is why we need the First Amendment, because otherwise we cannot watch, as individual citizens in this country, we cannot watchdog what's going on, not in this country and especially not overseas. This is why foreign policy is so vulnerable to the shutdown of the First Amendment and the political repression and the censorship that's just, taking place now all over the place. So yeah, media has everything to do with it, and it is to the credit of the likes of Mint Press and, several other, not enough, but there are numerous journalist institutions now that are doing a great job, which are all being suppressed, and it's our responsibility to help support this movement and to fund it and to promote it and share it and give credit where it's due. But this is absolutely essential to have a democracy. If the electorate is not informed and if power is not surveilled and if we don't have vigilance over power, it's hopeless. There can be no democracy. And, here comes fascism, which is already here, but, just more and more of it. So it's absolutely critical, to stand up and support our independent media, like Mint Press and others.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. As you mentioned, now as we are speaking, a UK court has granted Julian Assange a temporary reprieve from being extradited to the US, although that possibility remains active. What is your reaction to this news and on Assange and whistleblowers more generally?
So it's great that, and it's to the credit of the Assange advocates and the advocates for a free press who have been relentless and so principled, and to the credit of his family that has been so tireless in, stomping for him and representing him. And to my mind, it's absolutely outrageous that he is not a free man right now who's being compensated for having lost, 12 years of his life, that he has been targeted, including all the way up to the CIA plotting his assassination and kidnapping. It's absolutely outrageous. So thank goodness the court has let a little bit of daylight in, but this whole case has been such an expose of the corruption of the court system, including the US Department of Justice, which has absolutely manipulated, falsified, propagandized this case from the very beginning, which ginned up one smear campaign after another to try to isolate and incriminate Julian Assange. It's outrageous that he's in prison. Even if he were guilty of the things he's being accused of, he has never, which he's not, but in addition, he has never done a violent thing in his life. This is an extremely peaceful person. There's nothing dangerous about him. It's outrageous that he has been kept in this high security prison under, isolation much of the time. And his health has been absolutely destroyed, subject to the incredible stress and harassment. As the former UN rapporteur on torture said so beautifully, that he has not been prosecuted, he's been persecuted by 5 so-called democracies that all conspired to basically concoct a case against him. And, in just one accusation, which was around the Swedish accusations of rape, those alone were identified to have some 50 violations of fact-finding and of due process that were implicit in that case and allowed it to be dragged on for years. That was the way that he was ensnared, essentially, at the start, by the effort to arrest him on account of these concocted charges, which went on for years. So to my mind, it's enraging. The more you know about this case, the more absolutely just jaw-dropping it is. It's a complete indictment and makes a mockery of our so-called judicial system. So yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that reason prevails here, and that depends on what we do, again. And I must say, on day one, getting to your other question, on day one, Julian Assange will be a free man, and this case will be over. Edward Snowden will be a free man. Leonard Peltier will be a free man. Whistleblowers and political prisoners will, be not only exonerated, they will be heroes, and they will be thanked and compensated for their years of absolutely unjust and criminal confinement.